And the main thing that we're focusing on is unpacking those standards to turn into those I can statements. And some classes, some subject areas have, as we've seen, like more materials from the IDOE than others. And one of those things is called a framework. You guys don't, unfortunately, have a framework, but some of the classes have a framework that gives them some of those I can statements. And so there's two versions of this graphic organizer that we're going to look at. They're very, very similar. There's just one tweak for the groups that have a framework, because they just kind of do the steps in a slightly different order. But otherwise, you guys are doing the same work as everybody else. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. Can you guys see Canvas?
Yep.
Yep. All right. So in the module, you guys will have just completed this priority standards part, and I saw your guys' spreadsheet with those in there. And I just want you guys to kind of be aware, everything that we're doing is always kind of in draft mode. So as you start going through the next process, if you guys realize like, ooh, this one really isn't a priority standard, or shoot, we really need to add this one in because it actually does meet this criteria, everything is allowed to be changed. There is no like you're locked in firm, no changing it. As long as you guys are in agreement as a team and a PLC, everything is fluid. So you guys can kind of work on that as we go. So part two is unpacking standards. So why do we unpack? In this part of the module, we're going to take a deep dive into those priority standards, and we're going to unpack them so that we create this common understanding. We're going to determine our targets and goals for learning, and we're going to write those goals into student-friendly language. This is going to later help with us doing proficiency scales, which is the last part of the module. And those proficiency scales are what we are going to align our common formative and summative assessments to, and eventually that kind of course build work that will happen. This process is so critical to doing it as a team. We might know what a standard means, but each of us might interpret it differently. Or we might focus on one target of a standard versus another target of a standard. So when we unpack them as a team, each person in the team is going to walk back to the classroom with the same picture of what you want students to know. By identifying those specific learning targets through unpacking, we will be prepared to write those aligned assessments. And this is also what sets up our true, guaranteed, and viable curriculum. It's also going to answer that first question of the PLC: what do we want our students to know and be able to do? So when we look at a standard, all of the standards contain three distinct elements: declarative knowledge, procedural knowledge, and the context information. So the declarative knowledge is the set of concepts that we want students to ultimately know or understand. So what do we want them to know? The procedural knowledge is the skill. So how are we going to get them to know it, or in what way are they going to learn it? And the context is within what context am I learning that concept or that skill? And it's going to bring that clarity. So when I look at a standard, now this one is an English standard, and I will tell you, I don't have a PE example in this first part. But when you guys get to the point where you're actually working on this, if you want me to take one of your standards and do some of this work to it as an example, I am happy to do that for you. So this is an English standard. Analyze what a text says explicitly, as well as draw inferences from the text through citing textual evidence. So we underline the concept. What do we want students to know? That declarative knowledge. So we want them to know what a text says, and we want them to know about textual evidence. And how are we going to get them to know that? So what's the skill? They're going to analyze, they're going to draw inferences, and they're going to cite. And in what context? They're doing all of this from a text. So they could also change this standard, and it could have said from a poem, or it could have said from something else. So the context can change. So when we look in our next piece about how we take that standard then and identify our learning targets, we create these learning targets because one standard may be like one sentence, but a lot of times it actually includes multiple learning targets, especially if you have an umbrella standard that's kind of broad and general. you really have to pull the learning targets out of that. And if we don't do that together, then we're going to have uncommon goals for what we're going to teach. And then we're going to have misunderstandings with our students. So we then take those learning targets and turn them into the student-friendly I can statements, because this helps students take ownership of their learning and monitor their learning throughout the unit. It'll help them know what they are able to do. So a learning target is going to create clarity and that common understanding. Like I said, it's going to guide our instructional decisions. It's going to allow students to monitor their learning and then be written in that student-friendly language. And we're going to routinely share them with them. So if we look at that same standard that I just did all of that highlighting to, I actually in this one sentence see 3 learning targets. I'm going to analyze what a text says. I'm going to draw inferences from a text, and I'm going to be able to cite using textual evidence. So this one sentence standard that actually looks kind of simple is really broken down into 3 learning targets that will then turn into I can statements. And when you make them an I can say, a lot of times the I can statement is literally, you're just going to put the word I can in front of the learning target. Sometimes you might have to simplify the language a little bit more or add some sort of verbiage or something, because it needs to tell you a student where they need to go, where they're at right now, and what they need to do to close the gap. So what does this look like in practice, and what are you guys actually going to do? So in terms of our action step, I'm going to show this. I don't know, maybe I'm not going to show the video because it's just not like super practical, but maybe I'll show like a minute of it. So there's a video here. It's about 5 minutes long. It breaks down an English, a science, a math, and a social studies standard. And it just shows how like a 1 sentence standard can actually end up being like 3, 4, 5, 6 different learning targets when you break it down. So what you guys are going to do to a standard itself is you'll highlight the skill, underline the concept, and bracket the context. Underneath this graphic is a link to a Google Doc that's a forced copy. So just like we did with the spreadsheet, you only need to have 1 copy. You guys will, and then so one of you has to make a copy of it and then share it with the other 2. And that's going to be the kind of the place that you are working in. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. So if you click that and you make a forced copy, it's going to look like this. I don't remember exactly how many priority standards you guys had. But if you have more than 12, you can just copy and paste some of this. If you have less than that, you can delete them. Basically, these are quick links to different pages in this document, and it leads you to this blank graphic organizer. And this is what we're going to fill out. And I'm going to go over how to fill this out in a second. But if you need more of these, you can just scroll to the bottom, highlight the table, copy and paste. If not, you can delete them. And if you need help with that, just let me know. So you'll notice in the gray parts, there are steps: step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and step 5. For part 2, or for this I can statement part, the directions to fill this out are here on the left: step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. Notice this all caps statement here: do not complete step 5 at this time. That is actually the proficiency scale, and it is the next part of the module. We put it in this one Google Doc though, so that you guys aren't copying and pasting stuff from multiple places, and you can just continue working in the same document. So you're only going to do steps 1 through 4. Do not do step 5, but you will have one of these charts for each of your priority standards. So you're only doing this process for your priority standards. You don't have to do this for your other standards. So step 1 is to copy and paste your priority standard in its exact language into the top of the graphic organizer, and then do that activity of highlighting the skill, underlining the concept, and bracketing the context. So if I look at an example, and this example to the right here is a social studies example. But like I said, if you want me to do one for PE, I'm happy to make a PE example. So for the social studies one, here is my standard. Identify major physical characteristics of regions of Africa, Asia, and the Southwest Pacific, such as deserts, basins, plains, mountains, rivers, and describe their formation. So I copy and pasted that in the top box. And then I underlined my concepts, physical characteristics, and formation. I highlighted my skills, identify and describe. And then I bracketed my context, regions of Africa, Asia, and the Southwest Pacific. So when I look back at the module, that was step 1. Step 2 is to use the concept, context, and skills that I identified in step 1 to fill in the chart. So I'm going to use that information to fill in this chart. So literally it is kind of like just a copying and pasting out of this sentence in here. So what were my skills? Identify. What am I identifying? Physical characteristics. In what context? Regions of Africa, Asia, and Southwest Pacific. Describe, formation, etc. Now, if you're wondering why I've skipped this part of the standard, it's coming in just a second. So then from those broken down pieces, if I keep reading my instructions, I'm going to use that information I've separated from the standard to then identify the learning targets that me as the teacher will need to accomplish with that standard. This is the part where the groups that have the framework, their step is a little bit different. They're actually starting with the I can, because the DOE gets those, and then working them backward into learning targets. So you guys, because you don't have that, are actually doing it the way we're supposed to do it. You're going to go from a learning target to an I can. The other groups are kind of reverse engineering them. So when I look at these 2 targets, or this standard, I see 2 targets: identify physical characteristics and describe the formation. And then the last part of step 2 is to then identify the knowledge and skill vocabulary from the standard. So that was the last part of step 2. List any relevant knowledge and skill vocabulary from the standard. So the reason it says knowledge and skill, physical characteristic, formation, desert, basin, plain, mountain, and river, those are all knowledge vocabulary words. That's all content knowledge. But let's say the standard asked you to do something like, maybe it was the first time you've ever been told to compare and contrast, and you didn't know what that meant. That would be a skill vocabulary word that would need to be defined in order for you to understand the standard. So you guys in PE might have words like that, vocabulary words or skill words that need to be defined in order for them to understand the standard. So just kind of keep that in mind. Then step 3, this step is going to help you later when we do assessment writing, but you're going to label the level of thinking, and you're going to use the chart that's linked to help you identify the depth of knowledge and the number that depth of knowledge is. So I'm going to take those skill words like identify and describe. And when I pulled up the level of thinking chart, those are actually both level 1 words. So this actually tells me that this standard and the questions that would be on an assessment for this standard are probably going to be level 1 DOK questions. When we start thinking about words like analyze or evaluate or compare or create, those are higher level DOK words. So the very last part that you guys are going to do, because you're only doing steps 1 through 4, is to now take your learning targets and break them down into separate I can statements. In some cases, you may just put the word I can in front of the learning target. It may not be broken down any further. But when I look at the context of this one, I am not going to be teaching the physical characteristics of Africa, Asia, and the Southwest Pacific all in one lesson. That's 3 different lessons. So you might have a PE skill that you teach multiple times throughout the year in different units. And so you might need to say, I do or learn, I can blah, 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 blah in basketball. I can blah, 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 blah in badminton. So it may be broken down into those more specific I can statements. The I can statements, especially for you guys with PE, if you have those more broad standards that don't necessarily talk about like the actual skill that they're doing in PE, it's the I can statement that is your opportunity to list it. So for example, when I was working with health, they might have a standard that talks about healthy behaviors, and when they break it down, it just says like, I can identify, personal health and healthy behaviors. But when they get into those I can statements, they're going to say, I can do this by, knowing that personal hygiene, like washing your hair, brushing your teeth, and blah, 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 is that. So like you can get really specific in those I cans. And so when I break these down, I actually end up with 6 I can statements from this one sentence standard. So that's step 4. And that's where you're going to get to. You're not going to do step 5, which is the proficiency scale. That's later. Underneath the instructions is some more information about what to do when you're dealing with a vague or ambiguous standard. So when it's like that broad umbrella standard, or if the standard gives you an unmeasurable word like know or understand, it talks about how you can sub out that word to make it measurable by changing understand to something like paraphrase, or understand to contrast. So you guys have a lot of options. You have a lot of flexibility. And this is really your opportunity to kind of define what your standard says and how you're going to eventually measure it. I think that's pretty much it. What questions do you guys have at this?